The garden looked untouched. The same faded wind chimes swayed in the breeze, and Mom's ceramic bird collection still sat on the porch rail. The air carried an unfamiliar weight, as if the house knew something I didn't. I hadn't been back in a while. Too long, honestly. Life had pulled me away, and I had let it. But today I needed to return. Maybe a part of me was hoping things would feel like they once did, like home. I reached the door and turned the handle. It was locked. That was odd. Dad always left it open during the day. I hesitated, my hand brushing the old key, still on my ring. The metal felt heavier than I remembered. I slid it into the lock. It clicked open as smoothly as if I'd just used it yesterday. The inside smelled faintly of lavender, just as it always had, but the scent felt off. Stale, perhaps, or forgotten. I called out into the stillness. "Mom? Dad?" Silence answered back, thick and stubborn. Every piece of furniture remained exactly where it belonged, yet the house felt unfamiliar, as though someone had lived in it without me. I forced myself to move further in, switching on lights as I went. They flickered for a moment, then stayed on, casting uneven shadows that made the familiar shapes look foreign. I kept moving, my shoes tapping against the hardwood louder than I remembered. The farther I walked, the tighter my chest became. Something was wrong, but I couldn't place it. When I reached the hallway to my old bedroom, I heard it. A small cough. Quiet, deliberate. Close. I froze. There was no distant sound. Someone was inside. The door to my old room stood slightly open, and the glow from the lamp spilled out onto the hallway floor. I gripped the edge of the doorframe, trying to steady my breath, though my hand shook. "Hello." The word tasted strange, as if I'd spoken it out loud in a dream. The door creaked open further, and there, sitting calmly on the bed where I'd slept as a child, was a man. Not a burglar, not a vagrant, just a man. Relaxed, patient, as though waiting for me. He wore one of Dad's old flannel shirts. His muddy boots rested neatly on the floor, lined up like he belonged here. He glanced up from the book in his lap, a book I knew my mother kept beside her bed. He smiled, the kind of smile that makes your insides churn because you know something isn't right. Who are you?" He shut the book gently, as if not wanting to disturb the silence. "I live here," he said, calm, easy, as though his words were obvious, like telling me the sky was blue. No, you don't." I took a step back, the hallway suddenly feeling too narrow. "This is my parents' house." His smile lingered, faint and unsettling. "They didn't tell you?" I felt the world sway beneath me. "Tell me what?" "They're gone," he said simply. "They left it all to me. They couldn't just leave without telling me." But as I backed away toward the living room, my eyes fell on something I hadn't noticed before. A stack of papers sat neatly on the coffee table. I stumbled toward them, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Legal forms, deed transfers. My parents' signatures sat at the bottom, crossed out, replaced by his. The ink still looked fresh. This doesn't make sense. They didn't." He stepped closer. I dropped the papers as the truth settled over me like a cold weight. They were gone, and not just physically. They had erased themselves from here. From me. The man watched me with a quiet patience, like he knew exactly what I was thinking, like he'd seen this unravel before. I turned toward the door, desperate for air. The wall seemed to shift around me, narrowing, pressing in. I needed to leave. I couldn't breathe. "You should go," he said, as though it were a gentle suggestion. But his eyes told a different story. He wasn't asking. I fumbled with the doorknob, the cold metal biting into my palm. The lock clicked shut behind me as I stepped out into the afternoon light. I stood there on the porch, the wind tugging at my coat. The house loomed behind me, quiet and final, like it no longer knew my name. I turned back for one last glance, but the door had already closed, locked from the inside. And the man? He stood at the window, watching me, his face calm, almost tender, as if to say, "There's nothing left for you here." I walked to my car in a daze, the weight of the truth sinking deeper with every step. This wasn't my home anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. The realization struck me as I pulled out of the driveway. It had never been mine to return to. The dorm was nothing special. Two narrow beds, desks pressed against opposite walls, and a window too stubborn to open more than a crack. The kind of place designed to hold you just long enough until you could escape it. I didn't mind. My roommate, Neil, wasn't around much, and the quiet suited me. Or at least it did at first. Neil had mentioned that he spent most nights at his girlfriend's place off campus, which meant I had the room to myself. But after the first week, little things started to feel off. A shirt I swore I folded lay crumpled on the desk. A notebook on Neil's side would end up under my bed. Things that didn't belong where they were, but not enough to make me question them. Yet, then, the closet started opening on its own. Every morning, without fail, I'd find it cracked open, just a sliver. The kind of gap wide enough to let you know it wasn't an accident. I locked it one night, hoping that would fix the problem, but the next morning, the padlock was lying neatly on the desk, unlatched, untouched. It felt deliberate, like whatever was inside wanted me to know it could come out whenever it liked. One night, I woke to the sound of something subtle, a light shift, like fabric sliding off a hanger. My eyes snapped open, but I didn't move. The darkness pressed down around me, thick and suffocating, but I lay still, waiting. I could sense the closet door easing open, inch by inch, the scrape of metal on wood, the clothes hangers rattling faintly against one another, sent chills up my spine. I wasn't alone. There was the soft swish of something brushing against the inside of the closet, a shuffle, slow and deliberate, as if something was adjusting its position in the dark. The room became a maze of thoughts, twisting and turning, each one sharper than the last. Was it Neil? Had he slipped in without me noticing? But Neil hadn't been back in days. Had he? Then the door stopped moving. It stayed open just enough for the darkness to spill out, a sliver of shadow stretched across the floor, reaching toward me. I kept my eyes fixed on the sliver of open space, and something inside that darkness shifted. Something low, hunched. I didn't need to see it to know it was looking at me. The air in the room changed, as if the thing inside had decided to stay just a second too long, daring me to react. Then, with the slow precision of a careful hand, the closet door pulled itself closed. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I lay on the edge of awareness, my mind flickering between dreams and something worse, like the room itself was gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The next day, I tore through Neil's side of the room. The closet, his drawers, everything. His clothes were still there, folded too neatly. His duffel bag slumped lazily in the corner, untouched. It felt as though his presence clung to the space, even though I hadn't seen him in days. But I couldn't shake the growing suspicion. Something about Neil's absence gnawed at me, like an itch beneath the skin. I went to the dorm manager's office to ask if Neil had officially changed rooms. She frowned. "Neil?" she asked, flipping through some papers. "He was reassigned weeks ago. There was a room mix-up. You've been the only one assigned to that room since before the semester started." My stomach folded in on itself. Neil had left weeks ago? That wasn't possible. I'd seen him, spoken to him. His stuff was still there. I hadn't imagined him. I stumbled back to the dorm, my mind spinning. When I opened the door, the room felt smaller, like it had been waiting for me to come back. And Neil's things? Gone. His bed was stripped bare. The duffel bag, the clothes, everything that had cluttered the room just that morning vanished, as if they'd never been there. The closet door, of course, was open. Wide this time, not pretending anymore. Inside, there was nothing, no clothes, no shoes. Just emptiness. But as I stood there, staring into that dark space, something caught my eye. A Polaroid. I bent down and picked it up. It was grainy and faded, but I could see the image clearly enough. Me sitting on my bed, staring down at my phone. The angle of the shot made my blood turn cold. It had been taken from inside the closet. And worse, in the photo, the closet door was open just enough to show the sliver of shadow inside. And within that shadow, blurred but unmistakable, was a figure, crouched low, waiting, watching. The photo slipped from my fingers. The weight of the room pressed in on me, the air heavy with the sense that I'd been wrong about everything. Neil hadn't been coming back and forth. He never came back at all. The door clicked shut behind me, and I heard the soft scrape of something shifting again, like a hand pulling back into the shadows. I left everything behind. My books, my clothes, all of it. Whatever lived in that closet could keep it. I didn't care. I grabbed my backpack, threw on my shoes, and walked out without locking the door behind me. Something told me it wouldn't have stayed locked anyway. The door swung shut as I stepped into the hallway, and I swear I heard the faintest sound as it did. The soft rustle of a breath not my own, a sigh of quiet satisfaction. I slept in my car that night, and the next day I filed a transfer request. I didn't want answers. I just needed to be somewhere else. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel it. The sense that a door, somewhere, is slowly opening. Just a crack. Just enough for something to see me. We moved into the apartment at the start of autumn. 6 of us crammed into 2 small bedrooms, telling ourselves we'd make it work until we could afford something bigger. The building was old, the kind where everything echoes. Doors creaking down the hall, footsteps always sounding closer than they are. The landlord said it was perfect for large families. We convinced ourselves he was right. The first few nights were restless, boxes stacked everywhere, the kids fighting over who got which bed. The air inside the apartment felt stale, like it had been closed up for too long. The window in the living room didn't open all the way, and the fans only blew warm air around, making the space feel smaller. I told myself it was just new place jitters, but something gnawed at me from the beginning. It started with the bathroom door. At night, no matter how often I closed it, I'd find it slightly open again, just an inch or two. I blamed the kids at first, but they swore it wasn't them. Then the same thing happened with the closet doors in the bedrooms. No slamming, no creaking, just barely open, every morning. It was the feeling that got to me most. A strange awareness, as if the walls were paying attention. I tried to shake it off, but that unsettling sensation, that quiet, heavy presence grew thicker by the day. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I stayed up organizing the kitchen. The place felt particularly still, almost unnatural. I paused at the sink, aware of how loud the hum of the fridge seemed in the silence. As I wiped the counter, I noticed something, a faint trail of dust on the floor, leading from the hallway into the closet at the end of the living room. That closet was supposed to hold old wiring and pipes, sealed tight, according to the landlord. But the door was cracked open, just enough to show the darkness inside. I crouched down and gave it a cautious push. The hinges groaned like they hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the space was smaller than I expected, just enough room for someone to crouch but not stand. Then, in the dim light, I saw it, a folded blanket. Old, threadbare, and beneath it, a pair of tiny shoes, small enough for a child. I stared, trying to make sense of it. The shoes were positioned neatly, as if someone had taken care to place them just right. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rise. My thoughts spun, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just junk left behind by a previous tenant. That's when I noticed the scratches. Long, jagged lines etched into the inside of the closet door, so deep they gouged the wood. They weren't random. They formed words. A message. Don't let them out. I slammed the door shut, a chill spreading through my chest. I told myself not to mention it to my wife or the kids. They didn't need to know about something weird left by some careless tenant. But deep down, something told me I should have listened to that warning. The next morning, I found the closet door open again. And this time, the blanket and shoes were gone. That night, the noises started. Light footsteps, just soft enough to make you doubt yourself. They traveled through the apartment, across the kids' room, into the hallway, always just out of sight. The kids woke up crying, insisting that someone had been in the room with them. We saw him, my daughter whispered, clutching her blanket. He was sitting by the closet. I checked the closet. Nothing there. But I knew the door had been closed when I put them to bed. Over the next few days, the footsteps grew louder, more confident. It wasn't just at night anymore. I'd hear them during the day too, pacing back and forth in the hallway when no one else was home. One evening, as I tucked the kids in, I noticed something new. A small smudge of dirt on the floor, right outside the closet door. I bent down for a closer look. It was a footprint. Small. Too small to be any of ours. I locked the closet door that night, jamming it shut with a chair. But it didn't matter. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of tiny steps, moving methodically across the apartment. They stopped outside our bedroom door, The knob turned once, then again, as if someone were testing it. And then, the worst part, a knock. Faint but deliberate, like it was waiting for me to answer. I stayed frozen in bed, every muscle tense, my breath shallow. I knew, without seeing, that whatever was knocking didn't belong here. I could feel it through the walls, pressing against the door, patient. It wasn't going anywhere. By morning, the door handle showed scratches, deep grooves carved around the edges, as if something had been working at it for hours. Something small, something determined. I told my wife we had to leave. She didn't ask questions. The apartment had unsettled her from the start. By the end of the day, we packed up and left without looking back. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I told him we were moving. He only nodded and said quietly, "That apartment doesn't like staying empty long. It's been months now. I try not to think about it. But some nights, in the quiet of our new place, I catch myself listening for the soft shuffle of footsteps I know aren't there. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear it again, the faint sound of a door opening. Just a crack. Just enough." The house stood on the edge of the village, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and the sky always seemed a little too gray. It wasn't old, just a few years, the kind of place built in a hurry to attract new residents. We bought it because it was affordable, spacious, and quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but that's what we thought we wanted. The first few days were normal, unpacking, adjusting to the slower pace of rural life. There were no neighbors close by, only empty lots on either side. The nearest house sat a few fields away. We had space. It felt good, or it should have. Instead, the house felt incomplete, as though it had been abandoned halfway through becoming a home. At night, I noticed strange things. The windows creaked, though there was no wind. The floorboards groaned, as if someone was walking across them, just a second after I stopped moving. When I turned off the lights, the silence would swell. Not just quiet, but an emptiness, a void that felt unnatural. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the new place. The first real warning came when I found the door to the attic unlocked. We hadn't even known there was an attic. It wasn't listed in the blueprints, and we never saw it when we toured the house. The door was tucked behind a narrow hallway closet, as if it didn't want to be found. Curious, I pulled down the ladder and climbed up. The air up there was stifling, thick with dust that hadn't been disturbed for a long time. But what caught my attention was what lay spread across the wooden floor. A series of boxes, old enough to have gathered a layer of grime, but not so old that they seemed out of place. I opened the first one and found something unsettling. Papers. Dozens of them, each filled with handwritten notes. The notes weren't random. They were records, descriptions of the house, its layout, and the people who lived in it. Each paper had the same structure. Dates, times, and details about daily activities. They documented things like when the lights were turned on, who slept in which room, and what time the front door was locked. The most recent entry was dated just 3 days ago, after we'd already moved in. I felt a cold sensation trickle down my spine. Someone had been tracking us, writing down everything we did from the moment we arrived. There were no names on the papers, only one consistent label at the top of each page, Phase 4. I shut the box, my hands trembling slightly. Phase 4? What did that mean? And what were the previous phases? The next few nights, things escalated. The noises in the house weren't random anymore. They felt intentional, calculated. The taps in the bathroom turned on by themselves, running just long enough to make me notice. Lights flickered in perfect intervals, not like faulty wiring, but like signals. And the worst part, every night when I locked the front door, I'd find it unlocked again in the morning. We tried leaving the lights on overnight, thinking it might help. It didn't. I would wake up to find them all turned off. Every switch flipped down, the house draped in darkness. I began to feel like we were being watched, not by someone outside, but from within, like the house itself was aware of us. Then one morning I found the notes again, not in the attic, but placed neatly on the kitchen counter, waiting. This time, the most recent entry was written in a different hand, my handwriting. I stared at the page, numb. I didn't remember writing it, but it was unmistakably mine. The shape of the letters, the way I crossed my T's. It described everything we had done the night before, down to the exact minute I turned off the kitchen light. And at the bottom of the page, just beneath the entry, was a new label, End of Phase 4. Below it, in sharp black ink, was a chilling sentence, Proceed to Final Phase. It all clicked at once. The house wasn't haunted. It was orchestrated. We weren't just living here. We were part of something, a pattern, a sequence. Each family that moved and was being monitored, their behavior recorded, phase by phase. And when the pattern was complete, something happened. I rushed to the attic, determined to find more answers. I yanked open the other boxes. They were filled with the same notes, identical in format, but belonging to other families. Every family before us had gone through the same phases, right up until the end. And none of the notes ever recorded what happened after the final phase. As I rifled through the pages, my wife called to me from downstairs. Her voice was distant, strange, like she was speaking from the other side of a wall. I hurried back down, calling her name. The house was silent, empty. I checked every room, but she was gone. Not just her, every trace of her. Her clothes, her belongings, everything had disappeared, as if she had never been here at all. In a panic, I ran to the front door. It was wide open. The sky outside was gray, the gravel driveway stretching into nothingness. I stepped outside, only to find something waiting on the porch. A single piece of paper, the last note. At the top, in neat handwriting, it read, Final Phase Complete. Begin new sequence. Beneath it, scrawled in my handwriting, Move in tomorrow. I looked up, and for the first time, I noticed the empty lot next door wasn't empty anymore. A new family was standing on the porch of the identical house, boxes in hand, ready to move in. They waved at me with polite smiles, as if nothing was wrong, as if they didn't know what was waiting for them inside. And behind me, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard the soft click of a door locking. The motel sat on the edge of a desolate highway, the kind of place you only stayed at because there were no better options for miles. The sign buzzed faintly, half the letters burned out, offering only _L in flickering neon. I was too tired to care. After 7 hours on the road, I just needed a place to sleep. One night, I told myself, just one night. The room was what I expected, small, damp, and indifferent to the idea of comfort. The bedspread smelled faintly of bleach, and the wallpaper had warped from years of humidity. The air was too still, as if it had never been disturbed by anything alive. But the door locked, and that was good enough for me. I tossed my bag onto the chair in the corner, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to undress. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was dense, the kind that fills your ears like cotton. I tried turning on the TV, but the static felt worse than the quiet. I shut it off and stared at the ceiling. That's when I noticed it, the mirror across from the bed. It was too large for the room, mounted awkwardly on the opposite wall, facing the bed dead on. I could see myself reflected in it, slouched against the pillows. Something about the mirror unsettled me. It felt too intentional, as if the room had been arranged around it. I tried ignoring it, but every time I glanced at the mirror, it felt off, like the angle wasn't quite right. I shifted on the bed, and for a split second, I could have sworn my reflection lagged behind me, just slightly. It was subtle, too subtle to be sure, but enough to plant a seed of unease deep in my gut. I rolled over, facing away from the mirror, willing sleep to come. I felt the room settle around me, folding me into its strange stillness. The motel was quiet, too quiet for a place that claimed to be fully booked. But exhaustion got the better of me. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me, but when I opened my eyes, the room felt different. It was the same, familiar in its cheapness, but something had shifted. It was like the room wasn't quite in the same place anymore. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, and that's when I saw it. The chair where I'd thrown my bag. It was empty. My bag was gone. The chair was perfectly placed, the same as before, but there was no sign I had ever been here. A cold thought crept through me. Had I dreamed arriving? Had I even come here at all? I scanned the room again, searching for any sign of myself. A shoe, a crumpled receipt, anything. But it was pristine, as if no one had touched it in years. Then I saw the mirror. The reflection was wrong. It showed the same room, the same bed, the same ugly wallpaper peeling at the corners. But the man in the mirror wasn't me. He looked like me, same face, same clothes, but he sat perfectly still, watching me with cold, steady eyes. I moved my hand cautiously, and my reflection didn't follow. It stayed frozen, staring at me from behind the glass. Panic flickered at the edge of my mind, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stood up slowly, and the man in the mirror stood up too, just a second too late. I stepped toward the mirror, drawn by some awful need to understand. As I got closer, the reflection changed. The room behind the glass wasn't my room anymore. It looked older, faded, like it hadn't been occupied in years. The walls were cracked, the bed rotted and sunken, as if the room had been abandoned for decades. And then I saw them, figures, standing in the shadows behind my reflection. They weren't clear, just shapes, blurry outlines of people, dozens of them, pressed into the dark corners of the mirrored room. They stood too still, their heads tilted slightly, as if waiting. And they were all watching me. The man in the mirror smiled. Not a real smile, just the suggestion of one, like a mask stretching over something else. Slowly, he reached up, placed his hand against the glass, and I felt it, a pressure on my own chest, as though his hand was pressing through the mirror, reaching into me. I staggered backward, gasping, but not from breathlessness. It felt as if my sense of self, my presence in the room, was being pulled away, slipping through the glass. The man's smile widened as I stumbled, and the figures in the background began to move. Slowly, patiently, they stepped forward toward me, and that's when I understood. I wasn't the first. This room, this motel, it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a trap, a place where reflections could replace the people who stayed inside. Each person that checked and left behind a part of themselves, locked in the mirror, waiting for the next occupant to take their place. The figures in the reflection were the ones who came before me, the ones who never left. And now it was my turn. I scrambled toward the door, but it was locked from the inside. The key I had used earlier was gone. I pounded against the wood, knowing it was useless, knowing there was no one else staying here. The motel had been empty from the start. Behind me, I heard the faintest sound, the soft scrape of the man's hand sliding down the glass. I didn't need to look to know he was waiting on the other side, waiting for me to switch places. And just before the lights flickered off, I saw my reflection smile again, this time with my face. It was supposed to be a routine shift, just a bit of overtime in a new office building downtown, filing reports that couldn't wait until Monday. I'd been in the building dozens of times during the day, bustling with co-workers and the hum of printers. But tonight it felt different, empty in a way that wasn't just the absence of people. It was the kind of silence that didn't belong. The elevators chimed softly as I reached the 12th floor, but the sound seemed swallowed up before it could echo. The floor was vast and open, desks spaced evenly under rows of fluorescent lights that buzzed just slightly out of sync. I dropped my bag near my cubicle and got to work, telling myself I'd be out in 2 hours, 3 at most. The strange part began soon after. It started with a flicker. Not the lights, but the computer screens. Every few minutes, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them flash as if rebooting. But when I looked directly at them, they were fine. I dismissed it as the network updating. Nothing worth worrying about. But then the phone started ringing. One at first, then another. Their shrill tones cut through the silence, though no one was here to answer them. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was some glitch in the system. After all, things glitch at night, right? That's what IT always says. The ringing stopped for a moment, but just as I settled back into my chair, it started again, every phone on the floor now, ringing all at once. I stood up, scanning the rows of empty desks, the dim reflections of computer screens glowing faintly against the dark windows. I had the unnerving sense that the phones weren't trying to reach anyone. They were warning me. Then I noticed something on the far side of the room. A screen was still active. It shouldn't have been. Everyone's computer should have logged off hours ago. But there it was, glowing softly in the dark. I walked toward it, feeling the air grow heavier with each step. The closer I got, the more I realized the screen wasn't just active, it was open to a file. A spreadsheet filled with names. My name was at the top. I stared at the list, scrolling slowly. There were dozens of names, maybe hundreds. Each name had a status next to it. Checked in, active, or finalized. My name was listed as active, and beneath it, in tiny text, was today's date. The other names near mine? All finalized. I scrolled through the rest of the list, dread building in my chest. There were no exit times, no end to the records. Just names, people I recognized from the office, and many I didn't. The status next to each of them. Finalized. Then I saw something that made my stomach lurch. A second spreadsheet hidden within the same file. This one had only 2 columns, room number and occupant. The room numbers matched the office floors, 12th, 13th, 14th. In the occupant column, each room was assigned a name. The 12th floor, where I was currently sitting, had only 1 occupant listed me. The other floors were filled too. Names I didn't recognize, all marked as current occupants. There were no signs that anyone ever left. My skin prickled as the truth began to form, awful and undeniable. This building wasn't just an office. It was a place that held people 1 floor at a time. Employees didn't clock out. They became part of the structure, trapped inside without even knowing it. A noise broke my train of thought, the soft hiss of the elevator doors sliding open. I turned toward the hallway, expecting nothing but the usual dim corridor leading back to the elevators. But what I saw made my breath catch. The hall was no longer there. In its place was another room, identical to the one I was standing in. Rows of desks, glowing monitors, the same lifeless emptiness. And in the reflection of the darkened windows across that room, I saw myself, or someone who looked like me, sitting at a desk in the other room. But he wasn't moving. He was just sitting, staring straight ahead, waiting. The elevator chimed again, but this time it was different. The sound was wrong, like an old recording replayed one too many times. The doors opened wider, revealing not the elevator shaft, but another office floor, exactly like mine. It was as if the floors had folded into each other, endlessly repeating, with no beginning or end. I backed away, heart pounding. I tried to reach the stairs, but they were gone too, replaced by more rows of desks, more glowing monitors, all perfectly aligned. The walls weren't just rearranging, they were enclosing. The building was tightening around me, folding over itself, trapping me inside its endless maze of rooms. That's when I saw it, the other version of me from the reflection. He was standing now just on the other side of the glass, smiling faintly. His eyes were cold, distant, like he knew something I didn't. He raised a hand, slowly pressing his palm against the window, and I felt a strange pull in my chest, as if something inside me was being drawn toward him. The room tilted, or maybe I did, as if I was slipping into a space that wasn't meant for me. I looked down at the spreadsheet one last time, desperate for any answers. And there it was, a final note, buried at the bottom of the document. Each floor needs an occupant. You are now part of the structure. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, I was no longer standing on the 12th floor. I was somewhere else, another room, another floor, identical, but somehow worse. And across the dark glass, on the other side of the endless office space, I saw the next version of myself standing perfectly still, waiting for his turn to leave. The only problem was no one ever really leaves. The apartment complex offered storage units in the basement, small, wire mesh cages you could rent for an extra fee. They were damp, poorly lit, and smelled faintly of mildew. Not the kind of place anyone wanted to spend much time in, but we had too much clutter, and I figured one trip down there would be enough to get everything out of the way. I told myself it was temporary, just somewhere to keep the things we didn't need. The first few visits were ordinary, uneventful. I stacked the boxes neatly, locked the padlock, and tried to ignore the eerie stillness that seemed to settle over the basement. It was the kind of silence that felt heavier than it should, like the place held its breath the moment I entered. It wasn't until the third visit that things began to feel wrong. I found my padlock slightly open, not dangling, but just loose enough that I knew I hadn't left it that way. The strange part was that nothing had been touched inside. Every box was in its place, sealed just as I had left it. I locked it again and brushed off the unease. It's easy to forget small things, I told myself, but a voice in the back of my head insisted that I hadn't made a mistake. It got worse the following week. When I went down again, the door to the unit directly across from mine was ajar, though it had always been empty before. This time, there were boxes inside, large, unmarked cardboard boxes, identical in size, perfectly stacked. I should have turned around and left. Something about those boxes felt deliberate, like they were waiting for someone to notice them. Instead, I moved closer. The metal gate swung inward with a slight squeal, and I peered into the first box. Inside were clothes, familiar clothes, a pair of shoes, a sweater I'd seen my neighbor wear just a few days ago. I picked it up slowly, and the air seemed to thicken around me. I checked another box, a framed photo of a couple who lived upstairs. They hadn't left, had they? I could have sworn I saw them just a week ago, but these were the kinds of things people wouldn't leave behind, not by choice. I pulled open more boxes, frantically now, my pulse quickening. Every box was filled with personal belongings from tenants I knew, people who had moved out. Or at least, that's what I thought. The air felt oppressive now, pressing in on me from all sides. I had to get out. I turned to leave and stopped cold. There, on the bottom shelf of the unit, was a box with my name on it. The handwriting was mine, though I had no memory of writing it. I stared at the box, the letters twisting in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My mouth went dry as I opened it, my hands trembling. Inside was my jacket, my keys, everything I thought I had left upstairs. And then I heard it, the sound of other doors sliding open. One after another, the metal gates of every storage unit clanged open, the echoes bouncing off the walls like a funeral bell. I backed away, heart racing, as figures began to emerge from the darkness. They were familiar, neighbors I hadn't seen in months. Their faces were empty, devoid of emotion, and they moved slowly, deliberately, as though they had been waiting for this moment. They walked toward me, silent and certain, as if their presence answered a question I hadn't dared ask. No one moved out of this building. They were all still here, locked away in these boxes, waiting for the next person to join them. I turned and ran, my shoes slapping against the cold cement floor, desperate for the stairwell. But the stairs were gone. In their place was an endless row of more storage units, each one identical to the last. There was no exit. I stumbled back toward my unit, gasping for air. But when I reached it, I found the door already shut. The padlock hung loosely from the latch, as if daring me to open it. And that's when I realized there was no leaving. The basement wasn't just storage. It was a tomb. Behind me, the figures grew closer. I could hear the rustle of fabric, the shuffle of footsteps dragging slowly across the concrete. I knew if I looked back, I would see my own face among them soon enough. I yanked on the door of my unit, pulling it open with all the strength I had left. Inside was another box, sealed, labeled with my name. I tore it open, and there I was, curled inside, lifeless and perfectly still, wearing the same clothes I had on now. A mirror image, only this one didn't move. The walls around me began to close in, the air turning stale, thin, as if the building itself was sealing me away. I tried to scream, but the sound evaporated in the heavy silence, swallowed by the weight of those who had come before me. The last thing I saw was the door to my storage unit sliding shut, locking me inside. The figures stood on the other side, watching quietly, their faces slack and waiting. They weren't trying to stop me. They knew there was no point. And then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. When they came back on, the basement was silent again. The units all closed, the locks fastened. And in the far corner, a new box sat quietly, waiting to be opened. It had my name on it, but no one would ever come to open it. Not in this place where the only thing that leaves is memory.